Okay, so I hope that you're seeing my slides. And I want to start with some job ads. This is, oh, hey, how are you doing? Early career scholars get younger and younger. All right, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Um, Whenever I'm asked to do one of these things, I always start with current job ads because I want to keep abreast of what things are being asked for because they do change and also they can be kind of idiosyncratic. So here's a not a particularly helpful set of instructions. No offense if anyone has connections to Hofstra, um, but here, it says upload for your application a teaching statement slash portfolio. And so there you're like, well, which is it? What are you asking for? I would say, given that they're opening the door to a portfolio, if you had the wherewithal, you'd probably want to take advantage of that because it lets you show more of how you think about teaching. And you also have, I think committees are sort of splitting in two directions, where some committees recognize that they've been asking candidates to submit too much at the front end. And so they're asking for less initially, and they might follow up for more things. So you could have a situation where they just ask for a cover letter, a CV, and maybe a writing sample. And then if they're interested in you and you make the long list, then they might reach out to you and say, now we want to see your teaching materials. So I want you to be ready for whatever asks come up. Here's a biological anthropology position at Cal State. And here we have item 3, evidence of teaching effectiveness. This is a commonly used phrase that opens the door to all sorts of things. And here they're saying, oh, teaching portfolio, reports on teaching observations, and or student evaluations of teaching. Reports on teaching observations, we'll talk more about how you could get those. In some cases, like, I don't know if any of you know people who teach in the critical writing program at Penn, but just as part of their professional development, the instructors there are observed repeatedly by more experienced colleagues, and there's a standardized sort of report that gets generated. So depending on some teaching context, you may actually have some of these reports on teaching observations at hand. And here's one more from my homeland, which some of you can probably hear in the way I speak. A teaching dossier to include a teaching statement, sample course materials, and teaching evaluations. And then further down, you're also being asked to submit a statement with regard to equity and diversity, which can also include more commentary on teaching. I think this is a bit of a convoluted ask on the part of the University of Toronto. But again, my colleagues and I, working in tandem with our esteemed colleagues at Career Services, want to help you navigate this, where you're going to be seeing maybe some rather different asks in a single hiring season in your discipline. And again, we want you to be equipped to best represent your accomplishments, both as a researcher and as a teacher. So what are the things that we might put in our teaching portfolio or dossier? Again, this is the sort of obvious one, and that's what the Hofstra ad started with. And you're almost certainly, with maybe some exceptions in STEM fields, although chemistry historically likes to ask for teaching statements, even as our chemistry faculty will say that they don't know why they ask for them because they don't typically read them. What's said in the Zoom stays in the Zoom, friends, right? That's a matter of course. But you're going to almost certainly want a teaching statement. That's going to be one of the first things that you're going to want, because there's many people are asking for these. You want to keep this distinct from the teaching paragraphs in your cover letter, where typically, you start with 2 paragraphs maybe about your research, and then a paragraph on the teaching you did at Penn or elsewhere if you're a postdoc. And then what teaching will you do at University of Chicago or at Amherst or at Cal State Bernardino or whatever. So you've got that sort of overview of your experience and your teachables in the cover letter, so that the statement then becomes a place where you dig a little deeper and talk about your priorities as a teacher, and some of that could be, as a political scientist, as a physicist, where you're talking about things that maybe everybody in the discipline thinks about and thinks is foundational to your teaching. And then adding concrete and hopefully vivid examples of what goes on in your classroom or what goes on in mentoring students, for instance. And so this isn't really, it's not philosophical. It's really more about kind of craft. You want to ground it in the experiences that you have, but as particularly at the beginning of your career, parts of this can be forward-looking. And so if you're applying for a job where you know that at the Ohio State University, you're going to be teaching a 500-person lecture class, you probably haven't done that already. Probably a good idea to indicate how you're thinking about that teaching context. And you can do that in your teaching statement where you're looking forward. And that also helps sort of them, you're applying to be their new colleague, right? Not as someone who's just about to finish their PhD or someone who's a postdoc, that you're thinking about what will it mean to be an assistant professor at this institution. I apologize. Some of you may have done our teaching statement workshop, and you've heard me do some of this shtick before. And we can come back after I do the deck. We can open up and unpack any of these elements. Okay, I really do want to have make space for your questions and comments. Another thing, and I personally enjoy trying to put together syllabi because I'm a nerd, but I think not a bad idea to have a couple of sample syllabi on the go in advance of being asked to produce them. These don't have to be courses that you've taught, right? Some of you will have had the opportunity to teach your own class, others of you won't, and that's fine. These can be purely hypothetical syllabi, but that you've put together and they're ready to go. I think typically here again, you want to sort of show, you don't want to have two sample syllabi that are like, my dissertation turned into a class part 1, my dissertation turned into a class part 2, although sometimes that does happen. But you want to think maybe a bread and butter survey course showing that you're able to teach an intro class or a methods class, right? New assistant professors frequently these classes get passed to them because someone is excited to not teach it anymore. But then that upper level class or possibly a graduate seminar to show how you approach something that's more of an advanced topics kind of class, or something that's large lecture and something that's meant to be more of a seminar. And I would say, and I know that sometimes this can't be done, and I've pulled syllabi out of the air on short notice to get applications in, and you can't always make these as well developed as you might like. But I would say as a goal, really try to have a good 1-paragraph description, maybe identify some course objectives, try to block out all the weeks and maybe organize them by, in terms of having clear topics, or organize them into modules. And again, I recognize that this takes a lot of labor and it takes time. Identifying your readings. Now, in some classes, that might simply be identifying that you're going to use Jansen's standard art history textbook or whatever the standard intro bio textbook is. In other cases, you're going to want to, you're going to be building things from journal articles. And, a committee can perceive a lot about how you think through course design, right? So you want to have this be sufficiently well developed that it can actually show off how thoughtful you are in terms of your sense of what readings will work well together, maybe in terms of how this is a course where you're teaching students to read primary scientific literature for the first time, and you're picking things with that in mind, again, showing that discernment. And you'd want to be able to show, how you're imagining assessment functioning in your course. And, if you can't have everything worked up, but, you want to probably have something interesting to say about assessments or assignments. Again, you're trying to, you want these materials to motivate the reader to interview you, right? So there's got to be some stuff that pops and that says, and sometimes it's going to be the research, and that's fine. But for somebody else in the committee, it might be, wow, what a cool idea for an assignment this person had. And you want them to walk down the hall and say to their colleague, hey, make sure that you look at this dossier because this person has some really cool ideas about teaching, right? That's the hope, that you're going to motivate people to want to talk to you more and then to actually give you the damn job. Here again, we're taking it to the next level. This might not, I think this is going to vary by discipline. So, the one candidate that I have in mind was someone who taught languages, among other things. And, it's very common in that disciplinary context to have sample supplemental materials that you would include. But, you might imagine, again, in building out a portfolio, it does give you scope to actually say, here's what an active learning lesson plan in my intro to chem class would look like. Or here's an example of the kind of problem set that I would use. Or you're assigning a term paper, and you would want to then sort of have the committee be able to see how you break that into discrete building blocks to structure it so that the students can incrementally tackle this task. And some folks have anonymized student work to show how they give written feedback to students. Again, I'm not saying you have to include all these things. I'm just saying these are options, and they might agree with your teaching experiences or your sense of how people are thinking about teaching in your field. Okay, so going back to, we talked a little bit about teaching observation reports and letters. So the first thing I want to say is step outside of the portfolio. And some of you have heard me rant about this before because it's important. But remember, the gatekeeping function of letters of recommendation is super important in academia. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying what is true about how academic hiring works. And so my wish for every one of you is that at least one of your letters of recommendation is able to write 2 pages about your scholarship and then go on in some detail to talk about your teaching as well, right? In a perfect world, you want someone who knows the research and the teaching so that those things appear together. Now, that's not always going to be possible, and it's okay to have a letter that's just about teaching, but I think the gold standard is really going to combine them both. And in the North American context in particular, letters of recommendation are long, 3 pages, 4 pages. British letters of recommendation. Dear committee, I commend Petrie to you. He is adequate. Sincerely yours. An actual letter I have seen. Not the case in North America. And so you really want to have one of your mentors, and possibly more than one, have they seen you teach? Can they take the committee into your classroom on a particular day? It's not that they're going to write a minute-by-minute account, but they're going to go into some detail about the analogy you used that made it clear to the students, unlocked the conceptual understanding, or the impeccably designed lesson plan, or the way you got the students engaging with each other. Whatever it is, you really want, somebody needs to be ready to do that. And if there isn't anyone who's ready to do that, you need to try to make a game plan with your committee to have a plan for somebody to come and watch you teach. Or maybe you're able to do a guest lecture for one of your mentors. But unlike most guest lectures, they're there, not because they're at a conference. They're there in the room so that they can write a detailed account. In some cases, you're teaching for somebody who's not connected to your committee at all, and that's typical, right? You TA'd for somebody, they can write something up and pass it to your letter writer, where the letter writer says, oh, I haven't had the chance to see Emma teach, but let me share with you the perspective of my colleague, Professor Smith, who worked with her on course X. Insert paragraph describing your teaching or what they observed of how you work with students or whatever, okay? So all of that was not about the portfolio, but I really want y'all to think about that. And making the move from graduate student or postdoc to assistant professor, it's one of the 2 biggest moments in your career, right? The other one being tenure. Your people need to step up and do the needful so that you can be the most competitive candidate that you can, and that your accomplishments as a scholar and as a teacher are as thoroughly documented and attested to as possible. You could introduce a supplemental letter in a portfolio. Again, I tend to think that confidential letters are given more weight, but there could be someone who's observed your teaching where you think, oh, I can work this in a portfolio. I would generally say you want this to be, any letter you would want to be from someone who is in a faculty or in some sort of supervisory position, a letter from one of your doctoral student or peers, even though you might have had a very interesting and stimulating conversation when you observe each other's recitations, that's probably not going to do a lot for you. And similarly, the observations that our grad fellows do, which again, I hope if some of you have had that experience, it's a good experience, but we really don't want to put them in a position of trying to write a formal evaluation. It's meant to be formative feedback. It's not meant to do anything more than that. And again, happy to talk more about letters in a moment when I finish the presentation. And I'm almost there now. Oh, wait, did I skip? I skipped evals, didn't I? Yeah, sorry about that. This is important, obviously. So we saw a couple of those job ads mention evaluations of teaching. Even if they don't, if the job ad says evidence of teaching effectiveness, that's telling you get those evals together. We could have a whole long conversation about how problematic student evaluations of teaching are, and that is something that I take very seriously. But unfortunately, at most institutions, they are still being used for hiring and indeed for tenure and promotion, even though there's a good argument for not doing that. I would never want student evals to be the only evidence of a person's teaching effectiveness. Evals, the official institutional end of semester evals, are certainly unevenly distributed on this campus. So some of you may have them, some of you may not. Some of you may have them and not know that you have them, because sometimes faculty don't communicate this well to their TAs. In some cases, folks will come up with their own end of semester survey because they feel that the institutional questions aren't actually the questions that would be useful to them in terms of improving their teaching. And I think you could share some of those in a teaching portfolio. But I think the first thing that a hiring committee is thinking about is that official set of evals. If you have multiple sets of evaluations, maybe you've been a recitation TA for 4 semesters, you taught a summer class, you've actually got a fair number of these things, I would make a digest page. And that's where you could pull out some of the numbers and comments that you want to highlight. I think that you want to make your teaching portfolio amenable to a variety of different readers, some of whom are reading everything and some of whom only want to pick out some bits. And so I think that digest, there's going to be some people who reading this who will actually want to read through every set of evals. And there are going to be folks who don't want to do that. And that at a glance page will let them get a sense of how those evals have gone for you. I would say, again, to harp on the letter writing, you should share your evals with the faculty who are writing letters so that they can quote them, in some cases so that they can contextualize them, or that they can point out a trend where you improved semester after semester, or there was a bump in the road and that reflects something that's curricular, and they can fill in that context that says, yeah, when everyone who teaches course X tends to have a bit of a dip in their numbers or something like that. But yeah, you should definitely, talk through your evals with one or more of your mentors. And then I just talked about kind of organizing the evals, but you want to do that with the portfolio as a whole. So you want to, have come up with a pagination for the portfolio, have a cover sheet. So again, the beleaguered committee member can quickly find what it is that interests her in the portfolio. because some of these can get quite lengthy. So that, oh, and I want to just add one more thing, and I hope that you're already aware of this, but if not, so Penn Career Services actually is a well-known shop in the career services business. There it is. They were had one of the pioneering publications, the Academic Job Search Handbook, that's gone through several editions, and it has lots of genuine, anonymized, real authentic materials, including a couple of sample teaching portfolios. It is available as an ebook, so you can get it through Van Pelt Library and can access it that way, or you could get a paper copy, I believe, at Career Services, or well, maybe I'm lying to you. Let's leave it at the ebook. And now I'm going to stop sharing, and we can hopefully have some conversation.